In my previous video, I discussed how is a convention adopted uh, by the International Maritime Organization. And continuing with that video, today I'm going to discuss how does an International Maritime Organization convention or a convention that is adopted by the International Maritime Organization or IMO, it enters into force. So I'm sure you have studied a lot of the conventions such as SOLAS, STCW, MARPOL, Facilitation of Maritime Traffic, that is FAL convention. There are a number of conventions that have been not only adopted but entered into force. And today's video is how after adoption the convention enters into force. So the adoption of a convention, it marks the conclusion of only the first stage of what is known as a very long process of a convention being entered into force. Before the convention comes into force, that is before it becomes binding upon the governments or signatories which have ratified it, it has to be accepted formally by the individual governments. Each convention includes appropriate provisions stipulating the conditions which have to be met before it enters into force. These conditions vary, but generally speaking, the more important the document, the more stringent are the conditions of its entry into force. For example, the SOLAS 74 version provided that entry into force requires acceptance by 25 states whose merchant fleet comprised of not less than 50% of the world's gross tonnage. Another example being the Maritime Labour Convention, which entered into force in 2013, required it to be signed by 30 states representing at least 33% of the world's gross tonnage. So for the important technical conventions, it is necessary that they may be accepted and applied by a large section of the shipping community. So that represents the majority. It is therefore essential that these should, upon entry into force, be applicable to as many of the maritime states as possible. So when I say majority of the world's tonnage. Otherwise, they would tend to confuse rather than clarify shipping practices, since their provisions would not apply to a significant proportion of the ship they were intended to deal with. When the appropriate conditions have been fulfilled, the convention enters into force for the states that have accepted it, generally after a grace period intended to enable all the states to take necessary measures for implementation. Accepting a convention does not merely involve the deposit of a formal instrument. A government's acceptance of a convention necessarily places on it the obligation to take the measures required by the convention. Often national law has to be enacted or changed to enforce the provisions of this new convention. In some case, special facilities may have to be provided. An inspectorate may have to be appointed or trained to carry out functions under the convention. An adequate notice must be given to ship owners, shipbuilders, and other interested parties so they may take account of the provisions of the convention in their future acts and plans.